One of the most popular reoccurring things that crops up in the community are fan-made weapon concepts. And that's understandable, given that the last time we were given new weapons was back in Monster Hunter 4, or 4 Ultimate for the West, which was, I think, back in 2015, so more than half a decade ago. Fan weapon designs and theory crafting new ideas for weapons in Monster Hunter has always been an aspect of the community that I've enjoyed. So let's have a look and try figure out what makes a good weapon concept and why it's difficult to come up with ideas that would fit within Monster Hunter. So before we dive in, I guess the first question we need to answer is, do we actually want new weapons? Monster Hunter has managed to last for so long as a series, and it being such a long-spanning series has created a couple of issues that conflict, where resolving the issue is less about solving it and more biting the bullet and picking a side. One of those is the quantity of weapons that we have. Because on one hand, you've got players like me, and probably you as well. We've been playing the games for a good while now, and the idea of increased variety and new things to play with sounds really appealing. But on the other hand, the quantity of weapons can be really scary for new players. It creates a bit of decision paralysis right at the start of the game. And I asked a couple of my friends that tried Monster Hunter and dipped out early, and basically their responses were that the game felt overwhelming with its complexity at the start, and that it felt like it was a brick wall to get into. And one of the things that contributed to that was the number of weapons and how deep and intricate they felt when they were testing them out. On a similar but different note, there are actually people like us that have played the games for a long time that would actually rather not see new weapons, because they'd rather see the current weapons that we have be further implemented on and given more complexity themselves. But is that a good enough reason to stop implementing new weapons into Monster Hunter? No, and here's why. Number one, I want to see new weapons. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Please like and subscribe. Okay, seriously, when people suggest that they think that there are already too many weapons, or that the number of weapons is overwhelming, I think what they really mean is that it's not that there are too many weapons, but that the weapons are presented in a way that makes it feel overwhelming. And there are ways to solve this without stopping new weapons coming into the game. Firstly, if the number of weapons is beginning to feel overwhelming for new players, one option that could be done is to stagger the player's access to weapons. They sort of did this in Try. You wouldn't have access to the switch axe or the longsword until you'd progressed through the story a bit. However, Try also made the less popular decision of actually cutting weapons completely out of the game. But thankfully, I think the devs learnt from that. Locking weapon access behind story progression wouldn't be an awful idea, especially for players that are completely new to the series. But the bitter pill you're swallowing with that is that players who are veterans of the series may want to play with a specific weapon, and they won't have access to it immediately. But I don't think that that's reason enough to throw out the bathwater and the baby on this idea, because there are ways that you could implement a weapon unlocking feature or system while also having all weapons be accessible at the start. The most simple way that I can think of, like, overcoming that issue, just off the top of my head, is right at the start of the game, giving the players a choice, asking them to say, player, do you like technical weapons? Do you like heavy weapons? Do you like fast weapons? And then the player chooses, and based on that, they get, like half of the weapons unlocked immediately, and then the other half are unlocked later. That way it's a bit of a best of both worlds situation, because a veteran would be able to pick any weapon they wanted right off the bat, and a new player would be able to unlock them as to not feel overwhelmed. The only issue I can see with this is that if you wanted to play something like Charge Blade and Sword and Shield, then if they weren't in the same unlock pack, you would have to wait until later on. And I guess to an extent, this is also somewhat biased, as I like playing one weapon for like the entire story progression, and then branching out and playing with all the weapons later. But I know that sometimes people prefer to pick and choose the weapon that they use for the monster, and this sort of unlocking system would have more of an effect on their playthrough of the game than it would mine. On the other side, the idea of making sure that all weapons get expanded upon instead of having new weapons has always come across a little bit facetious in my opinion, because the obvious answer should be, well, let's just have both, especially given the current format of portable games seemingly having shifted towards experimenting with wacky moveset options. So it would be pretty reasonable for mainline games to add an entirely new weapon, while also condensing all of the cool ideas that the previous portable game had into one seamless moveset. That way you'd be able to more or less have your cake and eat it. I guess the other possibility of getting new weapons into the game would be to remove other weapons from the roster, but I don't really want to entertain this idea, as I like all the unpopular weapons and they'd be the ones that get cut, and that'd suck. So what would a new weapon look like? I think the best way to start exploring this is to look at how weapons were introduced in the old games. So the first extra weapons that were introduced to the game were longsword and dual blades. However, for the West, they were functionally part of the series from the start. But comparing the longsword and the dual blades to the original weapons, greatsword, lance, sword and shield, hammer, we'll ignore ranged weapons as they're their own can of worms. But the original weapons were relatively simple, especially back in the early days. Lancers are just a triple poking stunlock machine. The greatsword and the hammer were all about big hits, and the sword and shield did lots of little hits. The main difference between those weapons and the longsword and the dual blades was that the longsword and the dual blades added extra elements into the weapons. The dual blades were sword and shield, but now it has an extra demon mode that changes your attack options and increases your damage a little bit. And on a similar level, the longsword was a slightly faster hitting greatsword-ish, that after consecutive attacks would fill up a meter, and once you've got it full, you could do like an advanced attack and you'd do more damage. So after them, the first new weapons introduced to the game were gun lance and hunting horn, which were yet another step above in terms of complexity. Gun lance was a lance, but also a gun, and it required you to manage a number of shells that you had to maintain combos and to maintain damage output. The hunting horn was also very complex. It was its own beast in terms of complexity, being a hammer that you could use to serenade your teammates by stringing together attacks in a convoluted way, resulting in buffs mid-hunt. After that, in the 3rd generation, we got the switch axe, which, as the name implies, has 2 different modes of attack that you could switch between mid-hunt. And similarly, in the 4th generation, we got the charge blade, which was a switch axe, but instead of a great sword axe, it was a sword and shield axe, and it also had a lot of extra mechanics, largely around guard points. But that wasn't all. We also got the insect glaive, which, at the very face of it, seems pretty simple, and then you learn about the insect half of the weapon and having to grab extracts from the monster, and you've got a lot of upkeep to maintain, and all of a sudden it gets relatively complicated. Not to mention that it also gave you an extra dimension of maneuverability to play with via the Volt attack, letting you use it offensively and defensively. So, taking a wider look at all the weapons, I think the single common factor between all of them was the slow ramp up in complexity. And I think that's the first major rule when critiquing other people's weapon designs or when trying to come up with your own potential new weapons for Monster Hunter. A Monster Hunter weapon needs to be simple to use but complex to master. So something like a whip probably wouldn't work as a Monster Hunter weapon because it's just a whip. There needs to be something about that weapon to make it interesting. Another way to think about it is to equate the weapons to equate the weapons in Monster Hunter to characters in a fighting game. There's no point adding a new character if they do the same thing or if they don't have their own feeling that is unique from other characters. And as a side note, I think this is also the reason why there was such animosity towards Longsword back in Base Rise, as people felt like Longsword was overtaking the sort of the counter weapon niche that traditionally belonged to other weapons. Before we move on to the next big thing that makes a Monster Hunter weapon a Monster Hunter weapon, I feel it would be a little bit disingenuous to ignore the Monster Hunter Frontier exclusive weapons, the Tonfa and the Magnet Spike. Both of these are on the extreme side of feature/power creep, the Tonfa being a pair of Tonfas that essentially lets you fly, and then you've got the Magnet Spike, which is a really strange weapon. Up until now, all the weapons have had a sense of realism, and the Magnet Spike completely lacks it. And it sort of leaves the Magnet Spike in its own weird little bubble. If you compare it to the other sort of Transformers robots in disguise weapons like the Charge Blade and the Switch Axe, they're clearly understandable as weapons. The Switch Axe is a sword that transforms into an axe, and the Charge Blade is an axe that transforms into a sword and shield. They can sort of be understood as real-world weapons. The Magnet Spike throws this out of the window. It can change forms like the Switch Axe, but the first form is like a big clump of monster in a crescent shape, and then that transforms into a big club. Frontier was unavailable to play in the West, so there might be a culture thing, and that the Magnet Spike might actually resemble a weapon that I'm unfamiliar with, but I've done a fair bit of Googling on this and I've not found anything. Either way, this leads us on to the next rule of what a new Monster Hunter weapon might be, which is that weapons should be recognizably weapons. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the Magnet Spike is bad because it sort of fails this one. A weapon should be, for the lack of a better word, understandable. If we use something like knuckle dusters as an example, a good weapon concept doesn't need to be so grounded that it can only be a knuckle duster or like armored gauntlets. And in fact, to make the weapon interesting, you could combine it with something else, like a whip or a ball and chain, to make it sort of like a spring-loaded knuckle duster. But you also need to not go too abstract as to lose the feeling of it being a real weapon in the first place. So something like a gravity prong that transforms between a spear and a big hunk of monster material attached to a stick in a star shape just isn't going to be a very good weapon, because running around with a big star just doesn't feel like a weapon. In a similar vein, it's got to be a weapon class, not a specific weapon. One trap that people fall into when trying to make their own weapon concept is they put too much emphasis on themes or layering cool intricacies into the weapon. And don't get me wrong, they're cool. And I think one of the examples I remember was there was this really awesome idea one guy had that was based around a sickle, and there was lots of sort of theming and how it would be transforming into a mace, and the sickle would represent the moon and the mace would represent the sun. And again, a really cool idea for a Metal Rathalos weapon, or a Metal Wraths in general weapon. But this is a weapon class, not just a weapon for the Metal Wraths. And when you apply the sun and the moon to a weapon class, it sort of pushes out the ability to like have any old monster put their touch on the weapons. So at the moment, we know that a weapon concept has got to be a weapon, or at least recognizably one, rather than just a mess of blades and monster parts. It's got to stand out on its own, being distinct from the other weapons, while also not being so specific that it becomes difficult to twist the weapon's design and add personality from the monster when creating individual weapons for that weapon class. But the most important thing that we left out is the uniqueness that each new weapon brings to the table. And to an extent, this newness is allowed to break pre-established rules. And a good example of this is how the insect glaive was related to the new features of the 4th generation. If you had made a fan weapon design sort of before Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, and you decided that the unique ability of this weapon type would be the ability to jump in the air and the ability to like jump on top of monsters and knock them over, people would laugh at you because it strays away from the grounded feeling of Monster Hunter's combat system. And for the time, we're talking about grounded in both senses of the word there. And that's probably where the developers of the game have the fans beaten. We're creating fan weapons that have to be added into the game, so we're unable to incorporate new features that a game would have that we can't come up with. So to an extent, we're always going to be one step behind the devs on this, but that doesn't have to be a bad thing, because this actually gives fan-made concepts the freedom to be more creative. If you'd asked me before thinking about all of this, and you'd come to me with, a weapon concept about a weapon that lays down traps on the ground, or a weapon that lets you grab onto the monster and then pull it in different directions, I'd probably say that that's not really a Monster Hunter weapon. But when you think about it as a weapon that incorporates a new feature that is going to be the main gimmick of the next generation, then the possibilities widen. And it's possible that Monster Hunter goes in any which direction, given the last couple of games. And that's actually kind of great. It really frees up our ability to approach weapon concepts and be very creative with them. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I'd love to do more with this concept, so if you guys are interested, maybe send me some weapon designs that you have, maybe leave them in the description of the comments, or send me images on Twitter. That said, Twitter doesn't seem to be in a great state, so if you guys are using other alternatives, I'd love to see what you use. But if you send me weapon concepts, maybe we can review them in another video or something. Don't forget to do all the other stuff. If you like the video, please like the video, subscribe if you want to see more, but most importantly, I want to thank you for watching. See you next time.